October 1829. All the capitals of Europe have seen Napoleon on horseback. All the distinguished men of this era, to whatever nation they belong, have greeted him on the throne or in his audiences. There are no warriors who have not marched past him, as friend or as enemy. No one is more well known than the emperor in the external situations of life. Even the curtain behind which he devoted private hours to the concerns of government, the details of public administration, and the policies of his own household has begun to be lifted. Whether this curtain was the elaborate door of the Tuileries or the simple twill of a tent, the interior that it concealed is equally familiar to me, and I in my turn will try to introduce the reader to it. Let us look at him then in his home, in his cabinet, in his family, with his friends. Appearances, Jean-Jacques Rousseau tells us, does not reveal itself in large features, nor character in large actions. It is in small things that true nature is exposed. Here, it is not events, it is he himself. It is not his life, it is his day. I do not ask to be impartial. Must I deny it? Who can be impartial when people still argue over the previous day's newspaper? For that matter, can a secretary be? A secretary does nothing by himself. What he knows, he owes to trust in the private life that he has been admitted to. What can he see from a hostile standpoint? What can he hear with a hostile ear? And could he then go on to tell in impassive language what he was allowed to see and hear? It seems to me that anyone who respects the proprieties of such a situation must sooner say nothing than speak ill, and then finally to decide to break the silence of this post. One must have only good to say or wish to say nothing but good. In the cabinet, I was silent. If since then I have begun to write, it is because it seems to me that I had a final duty to carry out. The injustice of the attacks has long incited a defense. Even apology has become appealing. The public, more and more avid, sought out everything that could help it know Napoleon. It still welcomes everything today. It even listens to those who can speak only by hearsay. What a gift of encouragement for those who can speak of him for their own experience. No doubt, I will not be the first secretary who was a historiographer, but perhaps I am the first who thought of writing a historical treatise on the work methods, whose instrument he was. Others have probably disdained what the routine of the position made appear too familiar or too technical to their eyes. I believed that Napoleon would suffer more than anyone in not being seen from this new perspective, and I begin the task without fear of tiring society with these details, which, for any other age and any other man, would no doubt be of interest only to the innately curious. The only thing I fear is that the recollections, which should be merely those of the cabinet, are a bit too much those of the secretary. Certainly, some years ago, I did not dare to publish them, with the personal facts that in the first draft were recorded only for the benefit of my children. A revision seemed necessary to me, but my laziness has long drawn back in the face of a new task. Today, can it not consider itself excused from this final work? Cannot the publication which have abounded for some time free me from this concern? Now that readers are familiar with so many I writings of every kind, can the I of a secretary still be an offensive thing? I will speak in general of the era of the empire, but the cabinet which I saw most belongs to the historical period, whose beginning is the marriage with Marie Louise, and whose end is the abdication at Fontainebleau. Therefore, the Napoleon who predominates in these pages will be especially that of the final 5 years of the empire. Baron Fain. Part 1. The Inner Cabinet, the Emperor's Day, and his personal suite. Chapter 1. The Bedroom. The Emperor would get up during the night after his first sleep. It was ordinarily about 2 o'clock in the morning, dressed in a simple dressing gown of white dimity in summer, white flannel in winter, his head covered by a madras kerchief. He would go into his cabinet and spend silent hours with the important matters that the day's routine had not allowed him to ponder as he wished. It was also the time he chose to study at leisure, with the help of reports that he kept at hand, the accounts of one branch of government or another. If daylight surprised him during his meditations, he asked for a bath. He would go back to bed at 5 o'clock in the morning and wake for the final time at 7 o'clock at the latest. He then dressed. The reader would no doubt not mind catching a glimpse of Napoleon in this ordinary life situation. Let us then partially open the door to the bedroom. The Emperor's room at the Tuileries looked out on the garden from the end of the second-floor apartment. His bedroom was above that of the Empress, and between the 2 floors was constructed a staircase used for private communications. The Emperor's personal servants were 4 valets, Constant, Seneschal, Pilar, and Hubert, and the Mameluke Rustam. Constant, whose title was first valet, was indeed his valet. It was he who normally dressed and bathed Napoleon. Seneschal, who assisted Constant, had the same duties. The 2 others, Pilar and Hubert, were young men of good family who were educated and therefore less accustomed to this position. Nevertheless, they helped the first 2 as needed, preparing things and straightening up. During the day, one of them always remained on call in the bedroom to take the Emperor's orders when he returned there, and at night slept on a cot next to the door. Next to Constant, the Mameluke Rustam was the servant closest to Napoleon. Inside the bedroom, he put on Napoleon's boots, held the mirror while he shaved, etc. On long trips, he rode on the carriage seat. He could be seen on horseback next to the grooms when the Emperor went out in public. During battle, he was always behind him on horseback. Even hunting, he followed Napoleon carrying his guns, and it was this function that earned him the title of harquebus bearer. The Asian clothing and turban that he wore were a signal of the Emperor's presence. It is known that Napoleon dressed with the greatest simplicity, always in a jacket and white breeches. In Paris, he habitually wore the uniform of the Grenadiers of the Guard, blue coat with white lapels and red lining, and colonel's epaulettes. In his buttonhole were the small cross of the Legion of Honor and the Iron Crown. On his chest was the decoration of the Legion, and under his coat the great sash. With this dress, he wore silk stockings and shoes with golden buckles. But when traveling or at war, he wore boots and the green uniform of the chasseurs of the guard. In cold or rainy weather, he put on a gray frock coat. While hunting, he wore, like all hunters, the uniform of the hunt, a green greatcoat edged with gold and silver braid. His hat was always the same, small, 3/4, remarkably simple, in a crushed form resembling that of a slouch hat. It was the only part of his clothing distinguished by a light touch of originality. I don't believe he wore a bourgeois dress coat all of 10 times. He had an outfit made for the fashionable court circles, but wasn't comfortable in what he termed set accoutrement and rarely wore it. Overall, his habitual garb was as clean as it was simple. All his magnificence was reserved for the ceremony and splendor of the throne, but he did not wish that this expense, which constituted the majority of the wardrobe master's budget, have anything in common with the expenses for his personal clothing. Independent of this budget, which did not rise above 20,000 francs a year, Napoleon had another made up for his personal expenses, 2 uniforms per year, the necessary maintenance of his jackets and white breeches, boots, stockings, and shoes, and all accessories of his dress were calculated not to exceed 1,500 francs. The wardrobe master was in charge of seeing to this, and having gone beyond this limit was one of the causes of Monsieur de Remusat's dishonor. I recall very well that while dictating this small budget one day, the emperor interrupted me to ask the cost of my outfit, and, on my hesitating to answer him, reproached me for not knowing my own affairs better. The persons who, through the intimacy of their duties or familiarity of habit, were allowed to approach the emperor as he dressed were the wardrobe master, Monsieur de Remusat, and later Monsieur de Turenne, Dr. Corvisart, the primary physician, and Dr. Ivan, the surgeon. Often Grand Marshal Duroc was there. It was during this first moment of the day that Napoleon received merchants and disposed of all the small details which concerned only himself and which he wished to keep track of personally. Chapter 2, the Cabinet Rooms. The emperor's life was spent in his cabinet. It was only there that he was completely at home and by himself. It could well be said that all the other circumstances of his life were but digressions. However, he made a great distinction between his inner and outer cabinets. The inner cabinet was in his eyes merely an extension of his bedroom. It was private, and he would go there in his dressing gown, but he was always dressed when he passed into the other. It was the cabinet of state. The internal secretaries, therefore, had no rank, even in the imperial household, but the external secretary was called the Secretary Minister of State. Let us begin with the inner cabinet. No visitors were permitted into this retreat. When a minister was announced or one of the heads of staff of the house, the emperor went out to receive him or to work. When the work or the interview was finished, he returned to his sanctuary. This is a subject I know well, and the reader will bear with me for claiming his attention for some time. At the Tuileries, the inner cabinet was made up of 2 rooms. That where the emperor worked gave on to the sitting room of the small apartments, and the connecting door was always bolted shut. The other room was between the bedroom and the cabinet, and the emperor merely passed through it. It had a dark niche where the private exit to the cabinet was found, leading to a small servant's staircase lit by lamps. The groom or office boy, known as the keeper of the portfolio, remained day and night behind this door. He received and transmitted all communications through a window and opened the door only to secretaries. There were 2 keepers of the portfolio, Landois and Augal. One relieved the other every 24 hours. They were trustworthy men who held first rank among the grooms, receiving high wages and personal bonuses. The one on duty ate and slept at his window, never leaving for an instant but to attend to private needs. He did everything: cleaning, straightening, lighting fires so that no footman or daily worker entered the private section of the rooms. Augal, who had made the journey to Moscow, died at La Ferté-sous-Jouarre in the carriage which was bringing him back. He was replaced by Dejean, who had made up the same trip as a common groom. In the middle of the room stood the desk, of a shape unusual enough to be worthy of description. Napoleon himself had designed it, and he had similar ones placed in the cabinets of all his palaces. In the center where the emperor sat was an indentation in the desk. A similar indentation made on the opposite side allowed the person facing him to approach at a reasonable distance. To the left and right, the ends of the table widened and formed two circular surfaces for holding papers. This table had roughly the shape of a violin or a snuffer stand. Seated, Napoleon had his back to the fireplace, and in front of him the door leading to the sitting room. At the side of the hearth was settee, where Napoleon sat to read during breaks in his work. It was there that he was in the habit of opening the dispatches that awaited him. As soon as they arrived, they were placed in a pile on a pedestal table next to the settee. The back of the room was lined with the body of a library containing only a selection of history books. At the foot of a tall clock recessed into the bookshelves was a large mahogany table on which maps were unrolled and accounts spread. On the opposite side, along the wall facing the desk and fireplace, stood a long, many compartmented console. Various files were found here, and on the console's marble top were arranged the new books of the week. Finally, in the window recess was the table where the secretary remained continuously silent as the room's furnishings, responding to whatever the emperor asked, writing when the emperor said, "Write," and in between dictations, setting them on their way or recopying them. It was necessary that he be always present. This secretary also acted as a personal ambassador. If the emperor had orders to give to his valets regarding domestic service, or to his chamberlain or aide-de-camp regarding public service, the secretary arose, went to transmit the order, and at once returned to his post. 3 secretaries succeeded one another at this table: Monsieur Bourrienne until 1802, Monsieur Meneval until December 1812, and Monsieur Fain up until the fall of the imperial government. This secretary presided over the internal disposition of the cabinet. The rules for these arrangements had been made by the emperor himself, who always kept it in the same manner. Changes in staff did not alter it, as it was necessary that all traditions be faithfully carried on. Even the appearance of the cabinet remained the same until the end. Chapter 3. A first glance at the papers. The abundance of papers was considerable, as well can be imagined, apart from dispatches brought by special courier and parcels sent directly by each minister. Postmen brought other correspondence from every quarter of Paris, all the departments in the empire, and every corner of Europe. These were documents of every nature and kind. Not a single class of society failed to contribute its portion to this vast correspondence. That which arrived under official seal was by no means negligible either. The keeper of the portfolio received communications constantly and from all hands. Sometimes it was a chamberlain reporting from the sitting room what had just been communicated in conversation. Sometimes it was an aide-de-camp who, returning from an inspection, transmitted the information he had been charged with gathering. Each stroll, each hunting party produced its crap from the hands of an equerry. Every morning, the valet made sure to retrieve even the smallest notes he had found in the pockets of the emperor's clothing, on the mantel in his bedroom, or on the nightstand. As soon as Napoleon had finished working with a minister or a department head, the groom was careful to remove the papers and return them to the cabinet. Thus, everything was consolidated. Nothing could get lost or be diverted. The emperor's system provided for it. In all his routines, there was someone behind him whose job it was to gather up papers and put them back religiously. The most exalted as well as subordinate officers placed the same importance on this task and fulfilled it with the same zealousness, without making the slightest distinction as to the degree of interest the papers might possess, considering them all equally sacred. Given such precautions, any letter at all addressed to the emperor could not fail to arrive in his cabinet, and the post was certainly the simplest route. However, the common man has a secret preference for complicated means, causing him much difficulty. The devout believe God can only be addressed through the intercession of his saints. Thus, the officers of the house, great and small, never came to the palace without having their pockets filled with petitions. In their clients' circles, they were believed to transmit these confidences directly to the addressee, but the majority only left their commissions in the basket that the keeper of the portfolio saw fill and empty several times a day. The most conscientious addressed themselves to the secretary. The empress herself sent via her ladies the documents people had begged her to transmit to the emperor. Juno did not wish that her requests should in any way importune Jupiter's ears. No matter how encouraged by flattering persuasions, she remained only more reserved in order to render herself the more credible. When she was truly interested in a matter, without speaking of it to the emperor, she condescended to slip the paper to the secretary by her own hand or to have him hold it separate. The authors of these petitions, which flooded the cabinet ceaselessly, hoped at the least that their names would reach the emperor's eyes. Napoleon would have liked to read all of them, but it was impossible. The ear must choose among the babble of voices raised trustingly to the throne. Out of 100 requests or complaints, there were at the most 10 intelligible ones, and out of this number barely one which fell in the emperor's domain. So there was a constant battle against the torrent of inconsequential or personal documents threatening to cause the papers of state to disappear under their weight. But at the same time, Napoleon employed all means to ensure prompt justice to those for whom he was the proper arbiter. Thus, the secretary had orders to place before Napoleon only those papers that had been countersigned by members of the imperial family, the marshals and ministers, or the principal functionaries of state. They were the only ones that Napoleon kept to open himself. The secretary would open them only when the emperor was busy with urgent affairs and could not turn his attention away, and even then only by specific order, so that nothing pressing should be delayed long. The private letters and complaints that the secretary removed so as not to clutter the desk were spread out and placed in order each day with the greatest care, then subjected to a second sorting. Anything that might possibly be of interest to the emperor was placed to one side, the choice going to the small number of requests, distinguished either by a known and respectable signature or by some exceptional circumstance, something that would engage the emperor's personal interest. Certain to be included in this category were all complaints pointing to a serious miscarriage of justice to be rectified, or an uncertainty that only a word for the emperor could clear up. The matters were briefly summarized and daily placed in the petitions file. They lay on the desk to be glanced at when the emperor had a moment to see them. The week never elapsed without his having responded to them. The rest of the daily requests, letters, and petitions were sent every evening to the office of the Secretary of State to be distributed among the ministers according to their subject matter. It was only the extremely insignificant papers, the bizarre delusions, the ridiculous poems, the correspondence from lunatics that were burned, and there were many. Just as paper endures everything, so the post delivers everything, even that coming from Charenton. We have not even considered incoming packages, nor the emperor's dictation and the outgoing dispatches, and already it is obvious that a single secretary could not be sufficient for this work. Additionally, independent of the secretary, the emperor kept At his side, he had supplementary and auxiliary secretaries in the adjoining rooms. Various people at various times and under various titles took a more or less direct part in the work of the cabinet. A summary of the changes in organization and personnel in this work will not be out of place. Here it will be, if you will, the cabinet's biography. Chapter 4, the cabinet secretaries. One day General Bonaparte said gaily, "Ah, Brienne, you too will be immortal." "Why, General?" "Aren't you my secretary?" "General, tell me the name of Alexander's secretary." Later, Brienne was able to recall the name of Callisthenes. In fact, Alexander's secretary was Eumenes, who later had a part of his master's vast heritage. Plutarch says he was called the first secretary or the chancellor. Among the Romans, Augustus chose the poet Horace as his secretary. Nero's secretary has remained famous for the final service he rendered his emperor by offering his loyal hand to help him take his life. Suetonius was Hadrian's secretary. He lost his position through a scandal in which the empress was compromised. Diocletian was the son of a scribe. He deigned to entrust to his secretary, Sicorius Probus, the task of dictating the terms of peace to Narses, the king of Persia. This negotiation is one of the most interesting from the time of the emperors. The orator Eumenes was secretary to Maximian and to Constantius. His salary was 600,000 sesterces. In our currency, that comes to approximately 70,000 francs. Napoleon's first secretary earned only 25,000. Eugenius, secretary to General Arbogast, was placed on the throne of the West. By following him, the young Valentinian's assassination. The historian Procopius was secretary to Belisarius. Jean, the secretary of Honorius, seized the throne at his master's death. Attila's secretary was named Constans. He was a Gallic adventurer who Aetius had recommended to the king of the Huns. On a mission he was to undertake to Constantinople. The Emperor Theodosius obtained the hand of one of the richest heiresses of the empire for him in marriage. Attila had another secretary named Orestes, a Roman, become a Roman subject of the Huns through their conquest of Pannonia, where his property was located. At Attila's death, this Orestes returned to the service of the Romans and experienced a rapid ascent. He acquired enough authority to depose Julius Nepos, but declined the purple and gave it to his son, Augustulus. Of all the secretaries of ancient France, Eginhard, the son-in-law of Charlemagne, is best known. Pope Clement IV had been the secretary of St. Louis. Alain Chartier was secretary to Charles VI and to Charles VII. There ends the list of cabinet celebrities. Some more names will serve as a transition to pass to those of my time. A.M. Sarret was secretary to Henri II. Revol filled the same post for Henri III and Ferret for Henri IV. The secretary of Louis XIV was President Rose, who has left us a selection of letters from his master. There were 4 secretaries in the cabinet at that time, but only one had the pen, and that was Rose. The 3 others had only the title, and the access to have the pen was to forge the king's writing so perfectly that the result could pass as that of the king himself. The secretary of the pen wrote all the letters that the king wanted to or ought to write himself, but of which he wished to spare himself the trouble. They were those to sovereigns, to foreigners of high birth, to generals commanding the armies, etc. Thus, an infinity of important matters passed through the hands of the secretary. having the pen. I am ashamed to say that the famous Father Dubois is also on my list. Wishing to strengthen a career that was then only at its beginning, he had himself given the position of cabinet secretary, which had fallen vacant at the death of Monsieur Callier. His rise to the ministry later permitted him to give it to his brother, the priest Dubois. At the same time, the regent had Monsieur Melon for secretary. Finally, the last name somewhat known that I have to inscribe is that of the scholar Lefay. He was cabinet secretary under Louis XV. I come now to Napoleon's secretaries. While only the modest star of a brigadier general shone on his epaulettes, he was able to make do with the aide-de-camp Junot doing double duty with the pen and the sword. But the moment when General Bonaparte found himself promoted to commander-in-chief, a secretary was needed. The first to whom he accorded this title was Jacques Cousteau in 1795. He was a very young man who succumbed during the first campaign in Italy. Fauvelet de Bourrienne replaced him in 1796. He had been a schoolmate of Napoleon's and quickly became his personal secretary. It was in this capacity that he wrote the orders for the Italian and Egyptian campaigns. When he alone proved insufficient on expeditions, the general had him helped by two of his own aides-de-camp who were the best writers, notably Louis Bonaparte and Lavalette, and sometimes also by the commanding warrant officer, Leclerc. In the days of the consulate, Monsieur Bourrienne set up the cabinet in the Tuileries. Soon he added to his title of personal secretary that of counselor of state, and his influence seemed limitless. The first magistrates of state and the heads of the army vied with one another for his friendship. The second consul, Cambyses, begged him to hold one of his children at the baptismal font along with Madame Bonaparte. People believed they could discuss any matter with him. They entrusted him with all secrets, addressed themselves to him for all favors, and I must add that he responded most obligingly to the steps taken on all sides to approach him. Overwhelmed with tasks and solicitations, the personal secretary ended by needing a secretary himself, but only for his private affairs and relations. Monsieur Enoch, who filled this post, remained forever an outsider to the inner workings of the cabinet. The first consul himself gave Monsieur de Bourrienne the aides that he might have need of. First, it was aide-de-camp. Following the tradition of the armies in Italy and Egypt, the artillery colonels Duroc and Lauriston were summoned the most frequently to the cabinet. Next, it was General Clark, whom the first consul was long familiar with, going back to the time of the National Security Council and the Campo Formio negotiations. General Clark was in charge of various military duties, which the first consul followed up on. He had with him his former aides-de-camp, Cuvelier, Fleury, and Tournay, and established an office in the room next to the cabinet, that in which the bedroom was later reestablished. Cuvelier Fleury became the King of Holland's Counselor of State, and Tournay perished in the Santo Domingo expedition. Either Duroc or Lauriston worked in the room which separated the cabinet from General Clark's office. When the first consul wasn't dictating to them, he had them work on the examination and sorting of petitions. In these early days, such were the personnel of the first consul's cabinet. This internal arrangement lasted until 1802. A lightning bolt suddenly changed everything, and at the moment when Monsieur de Bourrienne's fortune seemed the most solidly established, the space of a single morning was sufficient to overturn it. Napoleon, giving way to serious dissatisfaction, decided to have nothing more to do with him. disgusted with the over-familiarity of a too intimate secretary. Napoleon would have liked to replace Brienne with nothing but a writing machine. At any rate, he decided to admit to his chambers only a very young man, one completely foreign to all intrigues, opinions, and factions, who could remain in the shadows a long time without pretensions as without importance. In this frame of mind, his choice was settled on a secretary of Joseph Bonaparte's, who had no previous associations except to have been the secretary of their brother Louis in the 4th Dragoons. A mild manner, modest habits, great reserve, and a timid exterior that delicate health made appear younger still seemed pleasingly combined in the person of Monsieur Meneval to make of him the petit secrétaire that Napoleon wished. Thus, Monsieur Meneval came to sit in Monsieur de Bourrienne's chair, but no more title of personal secretary, no more rank or costume. The privacy of this arrangement lasted nearly 4 years. Monsieur Meneval still wore bourgeois frock coats, while all around him wore court clothing. He had not even a ribbon in his buttonhole, when everyone else at the palace had already been decorated thus.